In this lecture, we will focus on Storyboard. The screencast will show you different features of Storyboard, which is the tool that allows you to design your entire application. Storyboard is extremely powerful. Firstly, we use it to design all of our user interfaces, and that is a really important aspect of your app. Secondly, we can also design connections between these interfaces, so essentially defining the entire structure of our app within Storyboard. To dive into Storyboard, we will first start by creating a new Xcode project. We'll choose the single view application template. That creates a Storyboard file for us. The Storyboard file is the most important file that we will work with using Interface Builder. Select the location for the project and get started. This is the typical template that we use to create most apps. As you can see, it comes with two source files and a Storyboard file. If you open the Storyboard file, Interface Builder will load and show the content of that file. At the moment, we only have one single view controller in here. We have different components of Storyboard that we will work with frequently. Most of them are in the panels on the left and on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we can see the document outline. This shows us all view controllers that are currently part of our Storyboard and different properties of them. Each of the properties can be collapsed or expanded. Here we can see we have one view controller scene that contains one view controller. Within the view controller, we have three components. The first one is the root view of the view controller, and then we have a bottom layout guide and a top layout guide. We will talk about layout guides in the other layout tutorials. Additionally, we have some ways to connect functionality to our code, and we will discuss that later on. These are first responder connections, exit connections, and lastly, we have the Storyboard entry point. This is the arrow shown over here. The Storyboard entry point defines the first view controller within our Storyboard. So when the Storyboard is loaded, that view controller becomes visible. In this very simple setup, we only have one view controller, and therefore it is automatically the entry point of our Storyboard. On the right-hand side, we have, most importantly, the object library at the bottom. Here we can see all the different views and view controllers that UIKit provides for us that we can use to build our apps. You select objects from over here and drag them onto your view controllers to add them. So for example, if you want to add a button, you select it over here and drag it onto the Storyboard. As you can see, for some cases, Storyboard will provide visual guidelines to help you place your objects on the screen. In this case, it shows us the center of the view controller. Let's drop the button over here for now. As soon as we have selected an UI element on the Storyboard, we will get more information on the right panel. You can see we have many different tabs over here. The most important one are the Attribute Inspector, the Identity Inspector, the Code Connection Inspector, and the Size Inspector. Let's first take a look at the Attributes Inspector. Here you can change most of the attributes of any UI component. In case of a button, for example, that can be the font, or the title of the button, or its color. If you want to change any visual properties about the view that you have selected, you'll mostly find it in the Attribute Inspector. The Size Inspector will give us information about the layout constraints that have been added to this view and define its position. As mentioned earlier, we'll have a whole lecture only concentrated on layout functionality, and we'll discuss the Size Inspector in more detail there. And lastly, we have the Code Connection tab, which is also very important. It allows us to connect Storyboard to our source code. For example, we can set up a method that shall be called when this button is tapped. We'll talk about this connection functionality throughout this lecture in detail. I will now turn on the mouse highlighter as we dive into some advanced details inside of the Storyboard interface. First of all, if you're working on a small screen, you will sometimes want to only have the stage visible and none of the panels on the side. You can collapse the document outline with this button here in the bottom left corner. That will give you a lot more space to design your user interface. You can open it again by clicking onto the same button. You can also hide the right panel by clicking the button here in the top right corner. If you hide both of them, you have the full stage to work on, and will be a lot easier to create complex interfaces on small screens. As you can see, the button that we have added to this view is now visible in the document outline. As your document grows and you add many subviews, it can often be helpful to use this document outline to actually navigate through your collection of objects and to select individual objects, instead of searching for them in the storyboard file. Many times when working with Storyboard, you will have to use Xcode's Counterpart View. That view allows you to view two files next to each other. And there are two main reasons to do that when working with Storyboard. You can activate the Counterpart View in the top right corner by clicking this button. Now Xcode will show two different files next to each other. On the left-hand side, you can see the Storyboard editor, and on the right-hand side, you can see a source code file. On the top right, you can see which source code file has been selected. Currently, we are viewing this file that has been selected by the automatic selection. The automatic selection will always select the source code file that matches the current storyboard element that you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at the view controller, and because the view controller has viewcontroller.swift as its custom class, these two files are represented next to each other. This view is extremely useful when creating code connections. Let's assume we want to perform a method when this button is tapped. Then we can go to the right panel and select the Code Connections tab. From the Code Connections tab, we can select different events to which we want to respond. Typically for button taps, we want to use touch up inside. We can then drag the touch up inside method and drop it inside of our class. Note that this only works correctly if you have set up this class here as the custom class of the view controller. Now we can enter a method name and hit connect. Now the connection is created and we can add code to this method. For example, a simple print line statement. This is the first and most important use case for the Counterpart View in Xcode when working with Storyboard. However, there's a second interesting one, and that is called Preview. Xcode allows us to see a preview of our storyboard files as they would look on an actual device. You can select the preview by going to this top bar here and selecting Preview instead of Automatic. Now you will see a preview of the storyboard file as seen on different device types. Per default, the iPhone 4-inch is selected. You can see that the button here is not placed correctly. You will learn about this situation when you learn about auto layout constraints in our separate tutorial. You can also add different device types by clicking the plus button here in the bottom left. For example, you might be interested what this interface looks like on an iPhone 6. And here you will get a preview. As you design your interfaces for different device types, these previews can be very useful, especially if you're not very acquainted with auto layout constraints yet and don't get them right the first time. Once you're done editing, you can either switch back to the source code by selecting Automatic again, or you can go to the full view, which gives you a lot more room to work on your interface files. At this point, we have already discussed some of the most important features that you will be using: the document outline on the left, the attributes inspector on the right, and the object library to create different objects and add them to your scenes. The last thing we want to look into in this short introduction is how you create segways. Segways are transitions between different view controllers. So let's add a second view controller. Once you have a second view controller, you can create a connection between them by creating a segue. We will create a second button that doesn't print to the console, but instead triggers the segue and moves our application from this view controller to the second one. Once we added that UI component, you can go to the right panel and you can see there's a section called Triggered Segways. These are different events that UI component provides that can trigger a transition to a different view controller. In case of a button, it's a simple button tap. You can set up the segue by dragging this connection here to the target view controller. Now you get presented with multiple different options for this transition. For now, we're just going to use a simple show transition. Now let's take a look at this code in action. Let's run this app. And we'll expand the console so we can see the text that we were printing to it. Now when we hit the top button, we'll see that text is printed to the console. This means our code connection is working. When we hit the second button, we'll transition to the second view controller. Not very spectacular, but it was very fast to set up this behavior in Storyboard. By setting up the Segway, we have basically covered the most important features that Storyboard provides. Firstly, we have seen a document outline that shows us an overview of all the different views that we have added to our scenes. Secondly, we have taken a look at the Code Connections tab and Attributes Inspector, which are the most important ones on the right panel. The Identity Inspector and the Size Inspector will be used throughout other tutorials and lectures. You also learned how to use the Object Library to build scenes and how to create segues between different view controllers. Overall, this short screencast should give you a good overview of how to interact with Storyboard and how to use it to build basic functionality.